All right, so this, what we're gonna, let's start by talking about what this is and what this isn't. This isn't really like a book club. I'm not gonna like lead you through the book and pointing out all the places that C.S. Lewis was a master of rhetoric or anything like that. What I really want to do is really make this book a tool for your spiritual life. And so the other thing that it's not is it's not necessary. So theologians kind of make this distinction between like ordinary and extraordinary diabolical activity. Okay, so extraordinary would include things like possession, oppression, obsession, and so forth. We're not going to talk about those. What we're going to talk about is what would be called ordinary diabolical activity. So the ways in which the devil kind of works in all of our lives and the way that they sort of act against us, and then sort of come up with some concrete means to combat them. Okay, and the reason why this is warfare is kind of obvious because when you're waging warfare, you can't just scattershot try to fight back against the enemy. You have to sort of study him, study his tactics, learn how he attacks, learn his typical modes of attack, where he tends to come in, and all of that. And only then can you sort of combat it. Okay, and I think there's no better book for sort of outlining the tactics of the enemy than Screwtape Letters, and that's why I really like this book and why I think we'll use it sort of as a broad outline for our discussion. Okay, so that's what the knot is. Okay, the other part, it will seem a little bit like we're jumping from like topic to topic, and that is just simply because the sort of stream of consciousness way in which the letters are written. Okay, they sort of a jump from kind of abruptly from topic to topic. And if you've read the book, if you read the introduction part, the prologue, he says something to the effect of, well, I'm not going to say how these letters came into my possession, but I don't think they're in order either. And so they're sort of out of chronological. The letters themselves are probably out of chronological order anyway. And then so he made no attempt to sort of clean up the chronology, and we won't either. So we'll just sort of go with what he has in the format he has, in the order that he has, and use that as our outline for our discussion. Okay.
Is he saying he didn't write it?
Well, he claims, like, I think that's a rhetorical, sort of a literary device where he sort of says, I don't know how this came into my possession. No, I don't think he ever actually said I didn't write this book. I think that was more of a literary sort of hook to get people interested in what he was saying, as if the letters just sort of dropped out of the sky for him. All right, so he does start in the first letter, and he tells a story about this is Screwtape. Screwtape is sort of this the senior tempter talking to his nephew to try to sort of help the nephew along in tempting and ultimately winning what he calls his client or his patient. And so he does start, and he starts with a little anecdote in letter number 1, and he says he's talking. This is Screwtape talking himself. He says, one day, as he sat reading, I saw a train of thought in his mind beginning to go the wrong way. The enemy, now anytime you see where he says the enemy, he really means God, of course, was at his elbow in a moment. Before I knew where I was, I saw my 20 years' work beginning to totter. If I had lost my head and begun to attempt a defense by argument, I should have been undone. But I was not such a fool. I struck instantly at the part of the man which I had best under my control and suggested that it was just about time he had some lunch. The enemy presumably made the counter-suggestion. You know how one can never quite overhear what he says, that this was more important than lunch. Right. So what I want to open with in our discussion is to begin talking about first how it is that that the devil talks to us. Okay. Let me try to put the quote up there now and see if that helps. If for some reason my internet gets wonky again, just somebody give me a thumbs down and I'll figure it out. Okay, so the point is, okay, so how is it the devil actually speaks to us? Do we hear this audible voice, or what is it? And then this little sort of back and forth that Screwtape is talking about, going on between God and the devil within this person. And so first, we have to sort of look at how we receive communication. How is it exactly that we receive communication? So words are spoken to us, right, or we read them. The words themselves are just symbols, right? They're just symbols that are meant to sort of invoke concepts in our mind. We either hear or see the words, and then we form these images, okay, in our imagination. And then what we naturally do is then supplement those images with other images from our memory. So we'll get an image of, maybe a grassy field, and then all these other images with memories attached to a grassy field will come up. And then from this, we sort of abstract ideas from it, and those abstractions then become our thoughts in our mind. Okay. All right. Um, so we could think about if an angel or a demon were to speak to us. Well, that's one of the ways they could speak to us, right? Audibly, right? Where they just either they sort of created a body for themselves to speak, or they moved air such that it made sound waves, and you can understand them. Okay. Um, but this wouldn't be sort of their normal way of communicating with us. Okay. For the angels, their normal way, the way the angels communicate with their angels, is they just simply take their ideas and put them into the mind of the other angel. All right, so they don't have things like mouths, and they don't speak. They just take their idea and then sort of infuse it into the mind of the other angel. All right. Um, so to do this, though, we'd have to be angels, right? So they don't just infuse ideas into our mind. Only God can do that. Okay, that's the place where only God can operate. God can enlighten our minds in such a way that He can put ideas in them, right? And you think about the sort of supreme example of that is like the prophet or sacred scripture, where these ideas are given directly to a person, and then they pass through the sort of normal way in which human beings come to know information. There's no abstraction. There's nothing, just the idea. And then for someone like a sacred scripture writer, they then have to then somehow make images to make the ideas make sense when they tell other people. Okay. And that's why I can never quite get it completely right, as far as like not completely right in the sense of that they said something wrong, but in the fact that they can't, no idea can be fully sort of explained by using words. Okay. All right. So angels don't do that. So neither do demons. So they don't just sort of infuse these ideas in our minds. So there's this principle that is scholastic principle that whatever is received according to the mode of the receiver. Okay. And what this means is that when you give somebody something, you have to give it to them in a way that they can receive it. Okay. And so when angels communicate to us, they have to give us that in a way that we can receive it. All right. So if they don't infuse ideas directly in our mind, instead they directly work on our imagination and our memory. Okay. And so they make certain, they may pull certain images out of our imagination, and maybe tinker with them a little bit. And then these images sort of come up, and it sets off a chain of thought. Okay. And you can see that Lewis sort of knows a little bit about this as he's sort of get the idea, because the Screwtape is trying to get the guy to go down a different train of thought, right? And he's hoping that if he simply gives the sort of the image of a sandwich or stirs up hunger in him, then his mind will go somewhere else. But he's not sure that it will. Okay. And so an angel or a devil or even your guardian angel can do the same thing. What they will do is that if they know you really well, they know which images to get you to go down a certain train of thought. Okay. And so this is why we have so much trouble figuring out, like, is the temptation from me or is it from the devil, right? Because of this sort of hidden way in which he operates. because it's natural for our imagination, for us to sort of have these, our imagination to have these active, sort of images pop up, sort of thoughts that come out of nowhere. Um, that can be from a temptation or just could be from us, right? And so we don't always know whether a particular temptation has come from us or from a demon, okay? And so what's important then um, is that, it's just like we do with sort of our personal information in the information age, right? We're real careful about that. The important thing is that we really need to make sure that our imagination and our memories are pure, all right? And so we try not to look at things that can be brought up later. We try not to draw up memories of sort of bad things, okay? Because the demons are like hackers in our mind. So they go in and they sort of hack into our memory and our imagination, pull up particular memories or imagination, and then use it to tempt us, all right? A lot of this is especially true for men who are more visual, right? Like a lot of men can remember the first time they saw like a really graphic image, um, and they can remember the image very well. And some of that is because they get help from their demons. Okay, but of course, everything we're going to say. This is the sort of disclaimer. Then, everything we're going to say during this class, all of the powers that the demons have, your guardian angel have the same powers, right? And so your guardian angel can protect you from this. Um, but your guardian angel, unlike the demon, your guardian angel normally will only protect you interiorly when you ask him to. And so in the midst of a temptation, you have to ask for the help of your guardian angel. So all of these things, just sort of keep in mind that, oh yeah, like an angel can do that. My guardian angel can do that, but so can a demon. Okay. And so this is why it's sort of devotion to the guardian angel, which Lewis doesn't talk about until the very last letter. Um, but the sort of the guardian angel will be weaved throughout all of what we're talking about. All right. And this is why it's so important to have a relationship with them. Okay. All right. So that's the sort of how they're going to talk to him. Right. So the demon goes in, sort of gets a train of thought going in the person's mind. And then hopefully the person then receives it as a temptation. But people who are virtuous, who are good at governing their imagination, governing their bodies, and all of those things, will often just be sort of able to just put the temptation aside. Someone who is not good at governing their imagination, somebody who is used to just flitting from thing to thing to thing, and always kind of feeding the imagination, has more and more difficulties with temptations. All right. Um, okay. So that's sort of how the devil speaks to us. All right. So let's dive into letter number 1 just a little bit.
Rob,
Yes.
just before we move on, you mentioned that only God can implant, I'm not sure if that's the right verb, but implant ideas directly into our mind. What prevents angels from doing that? They can do that to other spiritual creatures.
Yeah, we can't receive it that way. We can only God can go into um, only God can go into touch our soul, right? So what really happens is in the sense of, especially from the demons, when Adam sinned, right? He, in a certain sense, gave some of the authority over his body to the devil. All right, that's why like the memory and imagination are these sort of these material powers that we have, and that's why the devil can get access to them, because when you sin, um, the you've given sort of this, you've ceded over some power to the devil, but only God has access to your soul, regardless. And so only he can go directly into your mind.
Similar to that, what is the difference between an idea and your imagination?
Okay, so your imagination is just, your imagination just contains what St. Thomas calls phantasms, but they're just these images um, by which we abstract the sort of the idea or the universal thing behind it. So if I say to you, apple, right? Immediately, what happens? You think of an apple, but at the same time, you also picture an apple in your mind, right? So the picture is the image or the imagination, and how your brain, you could almost call it your brain, sort of manufactures that thing is drawn up from your memory from like all the times you've seen apples before, and sort of fuses it together. Whereas the concept of apple only exists in your intellect. Does that make sense, Ryan?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. So now we sort of go into well, diving into letter
Rob?
number one. Yes.
Just to go back for one more thing for the implant ideas, is it that angels physically cannot do that, or God doesn't let them do it?
I would say that they cannot do that. Only God can do that. They
Physically,
cannot do
not.
it with human beings because human beings cannot receive it that way. Only in the sense of God can it be received from God. So that's this sort of area that God has left only to His, right? And that's why when your guardian angel does it, you sort of have to ask him to. You have to sort of give him permission, and that it's not a full thing because God has also given your guardian angel permission to guard you because it's his vocation. But nevertheless, only God can do that because only He is sort of gets in the depths of man, and because that's not the normal way in which you receive things, right? So think about, Connor, if this helps, think about how we come to know things, right? There's two ways we come to know things. We have this sort of knowledge that we receive from things, from experiences, or from someone telling us, or something like that. Or you can have knowledge that comes directly from God. It's called infused knowledge, right? And the second only can come from God, and it's only and he does that by operating directly into on our souls. All right, so later on in letter one, then the Screwtape says, but are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. That might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not. And if it was proved, they really believed it. But what with that weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. Your man has been accustomed, ever since he was a boy, to have a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside his head. He doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as outworn or contemporary. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Okay, so this letter number one is sort of going into how the devil can keep us from distract us from thinking and thinking clearly about things. Okay, and especially going deeply into questions, right? So what God wants us to do is to examine things deeply, right? To contemplate things, and when you really begin to examine things deeply and you ask questions, like at the bottom of all questions is God. Okay, and so that's why Screwtape is saying here, don't do that, right? And this I think letter is coming sort of out of almost C.S. Lewis's own his own history. He was an atheist, and he found he was sort of found God by the intellectual route because he kept asking question after question, and he found that only Christianity gave the answers to his questions. All right. And so that anecdote about how he almost lost the patient because he was going in the wrong direction sort of shows the battle that goes on interiorly with us between actual grace and distraction. God uses actual grace to move us towards Him, while the devil is forced to use distraction. So we'll talk a lot about how the devil has this tendency to sort of ape God, where he tries to create something that is like God, but it's sort of a ripoff, right? So I mean, the supreme example, I guess, is like Christ versus Antichrist, right? And the devil is one of his ways to sort of counter actual grace, especially actual graces that sort of enlighten the mind, is through distraction. And so he tries to do the same thing. And so at the beginning here, Screwtape sort of chastises Wormwood for not keeping up with the times, and trying to use argument. Okay, so he's saying, in the past, argument might have been the best way to sort of take people away from God, because things were settled, and things were widely believed. Now, when no one believes anything, you have to be careful about argument. Okay, and so I think for our own sort of understanding of things, this is why it's really important for us to understand, you know, love is in the will, love of God is in the will, but we have to know about God in order to love him more. And we have to know the right things about God, and that, you know, having the wrong ideas about God will always end up with sort of wrong actions. Okay. But, you know, the other part of this, which is really important, is that, as I think what Screwtape is really sort of getting at, is the way in which the devil uses curiosity. Okay, and so I want to talk a little bit about curiosity, and then it's sort of counter virtue. So curiosity tends to be, especially in our day, where people will think, well, curiosity is a good thing, right? And so we got to make sure we define our term, because in a certain sense, it may be a good thing. All right, so if the devil has this power over our body, right? So he can sort of aggravate our passions. He could even sort of make us feel hungry, even if we're not. Okay, and so you know, it was well within Screwtape's power to make the patient to sort of experience hunger. Okay, but what happens though if the person is used to fasting, right? Well, it's not even going to that's not going to distract them, right? So the devil's going to sort of try to stir up this feeling of hunger in the person, and it just goes by the wayside because the person has the virtue of fasting, right? Okay, so we see there's one way in which sort of the virtue of temperance, which is a moral virtue, is really important. But then we read about when he talks about all the ways out on the street in which he distracted him intellectually, right? And so we need intellectual virtues too. Okay, and this is um, so so there's a second virtue sort of at play here. Okay, because knowledge always depends on sort of the direction we give to our passions, right? So the attention we give to our passions. And so the more sort of morally upright a person is, the more morally virtuous they are, the more fruitful their time of study will be. And so St. Thomas says that at sort of the heart of the intellectual virtues would be prudence, which is knowing the right thing to do at the right time in the right way. But then right behind it would be what he calls studiosity, or studiousness. Okay. And so here's what he says about curiosity and studiousness. He says, it belongs to temperance to moderate the movement of the appetite, lest it tend excessively to that which is desired naturally. Now, just as in respect of the corporeal nature, man naturally desires the pleasures of food and sex, so in respect of his soul, he naturally desires to know something. Thus the philosopher observes, all men have a natural desire for knowledge. The moderation of this desire pertains to the virtue of studiousness, wherefore it follows that studiousness is a potential part of temperance as a subordinate virtue annexed to a principal virtue. Okay, so what is he saying here? He's saying, okay, well, just like we have this natural desire for food, we also have this natural desire for intellectual food, natural desire for knowledge, right? In fact, that's the sort of play that we see sort of in the fall, right, where there's this apple that looks good to eat that carries with it from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? And so this natural desire for food and this natural desire for knowledge sort of go hand in hand, with the natural desire for knowledge being something higher, right? But again, because we're fallen, it has to be sort of curbed in some way, and we have to learn how to govern it properly. Okay, and this is the virtue of studiousness. Okay, so by fostering this virtue of studiousness, or this habit of what we'll call study, and we'll talk more about it in a second, we sort of refuse to feed the intellect with whatever's coming at us, right? We refuse to feed it with things we don't need to know about, or things that are beyond our capability of knowing, or even just like what I would call sort of like the junk food of knowledge, which is just a whole bunch of facts. All right. So what St. Thomas says is that you know, the intellect is not meant to just gather up facts, but it's meant to sort of feast on the truth. Okay. And so this sort of steady diet of facts, which is again why Screwtape was talking about using the press, right? So most of the press time just gives you a lot of facts, not so much truth. Not and not in the sense of like they're lying, but in the sense of when you have a bunch of facts and you don't have a context in which to put the facts, that's when you never get to truth. Okay. And so this sort of gluttony of just facts um, makes us really sluggish, right? And we become more and more curious because the mind is never going to get full, right? The mind can only get full on truth. And when you gobble up all these facts, you're never going to get full. And so there's this sort of spiritual laziness that accompanies curiosity. And that's why St. Thomas sort of saw it as this like daughter vice of sloth or acedia. So curiosity then, I think, is the desire for knowledge simply for the pleasure that it brings. Okay, so it's just simply the pleasure of knowing something, right? Like you think about, like you'll hear two people talking about somebody, and you'll be like, I want to know what they're talking about, and you go over and you find out, right? And you didn't really have any reason to know, right? You were just curious, right? And you can see how that could be harmful, right? Because you have nothing, no context in which to put that, right? Whereas what we're supposed to know, the things we're supposed to know are for the sake of the knowledge that we gain from the thing itself, right? Not for the pleasure of knowing. Okay. Um, and so study, as opposed to something like gossip, which sort of just brings us pleasure knowing something bad about someone, um, is sort of this keen application of the mind to something specific. Okay. And then the studious person has no time for gossip, right? And there's this famous sort of story of St. Thomas Aquinas where he's sitting at the table with well, not yet Saint Louis IX, but he's invited to dinner with the king, and he's sitting there, and you can imagine all this sort of chatter going on around him, and in the midst of it, he's lost in thought, and he slams his fist down on the table and he says, "That solves the Manichees," because he was thinking about the Manichean heresy, right? So he had this habit of going deeply into things, and again, whether that socially is kind of awkward or weird. But the interesting thing about the story is that slamming the table in front of the king probably not that great of an idea, right? And immediately the king goes, Saint Louis IX says, "Go get him a pen and a parchment so he can write this down." So he too had the habit of studiousness. All right, and so sort of knowing the difference between studiousness and curiosity is important. Okay, um, and so St. Thomas gives us 4 ways in which you've crossed the line between studiosity and curiosity. Okay, he says the first is when a man is withdrawn by less profitable study from a study that is an obligation incumbent upon him. All right, and so think about when you're sitting actually studying, right, studying exams, and you keep getting this temptation. Well, let me just go check social media for a second, or let me just see what the weather is tomorrow. Let me just see, right? That's curiosity, right? That's the vice of curiosity. Someone with the virtue of studiosity, that never happens, okay? And so you could imagine, like St. Thomas Aquinas, in an age of social media and the internet. I mean, this is pretty prophetic, right? It's sort of the whole curiosity is what drives the entire social media phenomenon, right? And then he says the second would be when a man studies to learn of one by whom it is unlawful to be taught, as in the case of those who seek to know the future through demons. This is superstitious curiosity, all right? So he's talking about the obvious things like tarot cards, Ouija boards, consulting these sort of any sort of divination. But I think he's also talking about porn here as well, and how sort of curiosity is almost always the gateway into a porn addiction. So I think he has that in mind as well, even though they didn't necessarily have it in his time. All right, so third, he says third, when a man desires to know the truth about creatures without referring his knowledge to its due end, which is what we already talked about, which is namely the knowledge of God, right? And so what he's really talking about is ultimately this habit of contemplating things, right? And sort of coming to the habit of really, when you study something, and this is where sort of modern science is very different, right? Modern science studies a thing so that it can be mastered or explained away, right? Whereas, science, if you go back 500-600 years, always studied things to see how they fit in the overall context of like creation. right? So this habit of contemplating things, and then of course when you don't study things in that way, then technology becomes a trap because we become power hungry, and then it loses its connection to morality, right? And so science and scientists have to be governed by this virtue of studiosity. And then the fourth way, he says, when a man studies to know the truth above the capacity of his own intelligence, uh, and I think this sort of has to do with the way uh, there are a lot of expert epidemiologists right now, and and all those things where people are really starting to kind of talk to talk, right? Where you talk to talk and try to pretend you know way more than you are. And so St. Thomas always comes at sort of knowledge with humility of sort of seeing it, understanding your own level of intelligence, one understanding where your gifts lie and what you can sort of understand and what you can't. Okay, so that's curiosity. Um, so in letter number 2, then, um, Screwtape now, it opens up with him sort of chastising Wormwood for the fact that his patient um, had become a Christian. Okay, and so there's two main weapons I think here that Screwtape uses. The first is disillusionment with the church, and then he's going to talk about uh, the way in which, and I think this is really valuable, the way in which the devil tends to attack beginners in the spiritual life. All right, so we'll start with the sort of the disillusionment with the church. All right, so here's what Screwtape says. He says, one of our great allies at the present is the church itself. Do not misunderstand me, and I do not mean the church as we see her spread out through all time and space and rooted in eternity, terrible as an army with banners. That, I confess, is a spectacle which makes our boldest tempters uneasy, but unfortunately is quite invisible to these humans. All you patient, all your patient sees is the half-finished sham Gothic erection on the new building estate. He sees the local grocer with rather an oily expression on his face make his mind flit to and fro between an expression like the body of Christ and the actual faces in the next pew. It matters very little, of course, what kind of people the next pew really contains. All right, so what I sort of want to get at here, and I think this is sort of appropriate, especially given the times we live in, um, is how to see the church as holy, right? So one of the marks, right? I believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. One of the marks is its holiness, right? And you look around and it seems to be far from it, right? You see saints and sinners all mingled together, all right? And that can be a great scandal, right? It was, I think, one of the sort of famous examples is like Gandhi, who said, I really like your Jesus, or I really like your Christ, I just don't like your Christians, right? And so how Christians can tend to scandalize by their behavior, and especially scandalize people who are sort of seeking. So let's talk a little bit about the church's holiness, so we kind of have a grasp and understanding of that, and begin to see it more than more as an organism and not as an institution. All right, and so the church's history obviously is sort of riddled with scandals and scoundrels, um, and quite honestly, like there are times throughout history when one of the greatest weapons against the church is the church itself, right? Where people just sort of point out scandals. We're living through times like that now. And those who would sort of otherwise be open to the truth, um, you know, that's found only in the church are turned away immediately. I mean, I know someone, pretty close to me who, I asked her, I said, well, why aren't you Catholic? And the answer was, I can't, with all the scandals, I can't be Catholic. And it's a very difficult, and in a lot of ways sort of left me speechless. It's a very difficult thing to respond to. But I think if we can sort of wrap our minds around the holiness of the church and understanding, at least for us, uh, it won't be as sort of scandalous, and we begin to understand why God works the way He does with the church. Okay, and so the image that St. Paul usually uses, or not usually, but often uses for the church is the body of Christ. All right, and this will help us, I think, at least for me, it helps to sort of see how the church is holy. And the church has sort of attached the term mystical to it in order to distinguish it from Christ's physical body. And so this richness of the mystical body of Christ sort of helps us to understand the church a little bit better in the way, at least in the way that Christ intends us to, right? So at the end of Matthew's gospel, Christ says something. He says that he tells the apostles that he will be with us to the end of the age. All right. And the question always is, and this is an important question, especially for Protestants, is, well, how? How is that true? Because he's saying that, in fact, Matthew emphasizes it so much that if you read his gospel, he doesn't even bother telling the story about Christ actually ascending into heaven, right? He just glosses over that because it's so fixated on the promise. And so it's not just a mere spiritual presence, right? Because he's physically present to them there. And this physical presence is just like the incarnation. And this is, again, going to St. Paul, right? He had this real sort of encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. And Jesus says to him, "Why are you persecuting me?" Right? Me, physically, me the person. And Saul says, "Who are you that and he says, why are you persecuting me?" And he's persecuting his church, right? And he says, "Who are you?" And he says, I'm Jesus, right? And he doesn't say, "Why are you persecuting my followers?" Right? He's saying, why do you persecute me? It's his person, not his followers. And so you can't sort of persecute spiritual followers, right? It's physical persecution. And so that idea of the body of Christ isn't just a metaphor, but it's a way to sort of for us to understand that the church is the extension of the incarnation throughout history. All right. So the church is the extension of the incarnation throughout history. So the eternal Son of God, second person of the Trinity, took a new body to himself at Pentecost, right? Where he sort of takes on the body, where he is now, he has just like the first body he took on. This one is physical and tangible. And so we can now look at the human nature, the human body that he took upon himself a little bit as an analogy for us to understand the church, right? So, so he makes God, the invisible God, visible, and his human nature is the way that that's done, and specifically his body. And so he uses his physical body to win our salvation, just in the same way that he uses his mystical body to distribute the fruits of salvation through space and time. Okay. But it also suffers the same sort of defects that his physical body did as well, right? So he would walk around, his physical body would get tired, it would get dirty, he'd have to bathe, he'd have to have his feet washed, and so the same thing sort of happened, right? Where people would look at him and go, "Yeah, that's a pretty impressive guy, but that's no God," right? And just like to look at the church and like, "Yeah, well, it's an institution that's been around for a long time, but that doesn't make it divine," right? And so there's this hiddenness in the church that's also hidden in the physical body of Christ. And so, in other words, when we sort of see the church as an institution instead of this organism, then we realize that the church is holy for the same reason that the physical body of Christ was holy. Why was the physical body of Christ holy? Because it was his body, right? It contained him, right? And so the church is holy because Jesus is a member of the church and he's the head of it, right? And head, not in the sense of like the CEO, but like the head that like sits between your shoulders, right? And so so there are parts of the body that get dirty and that that could get some sort of disease or something like that, right? And that doesn't make the body any less holy. It just makes it a human body, or it just makes it human, right? And so, well, why doesn't God just excise those pieces off, right? Well, because it's then the church's job to bring those, to heal those other parts of the body, right? So, So this is, the way a body works, right? Where the body, there's a sort of a diseased part, and the whole body comes together and works to heal that, right? And so that, the church is sort of like the immune system, right? Where there's a sickness in a certain place of the body, and it goes to work to sort of to heal it, all right? Um, and so we can't be sort of scandalized by sinful members. Um, and just understanding that Christ already planned for that, right? You think about, all of the stories he tells in Matthew's gospel about, making sure you don't, they don't harvest too soon, right? Because some of them look like weeds, but they're really wheat. Um, and so we have to be really, really sort of vigilant, and not only in not creating scandal, but not being so scandalized by things, right? And you can see that's especially dangerous sort of at the beginning, and that's why Lewis sort of puts it here um, at the beginning as the sort of first thing that the patient encounters. All right. Then later in the letter, um, he talks about what I think will be the most sort of spiritually fruitful for us, and this is the way that the devil tends to attack people who are beginners in the spiritual life. Um, Now, it seems like when you read this at first that C.S. Lewis has a sort of a grasp on someone like St. John of the Cross, who we're going to talk about in a minute, because he seems to understand the stages of the interior life, um, and whether that's Lewis's intention or not, it's very clear that the devil understands the different stages of the interior life, and how at the beginning is when the devil's attacks are the most acute, and really the hardest to sort of not get dragged into. And so Lewis in this letter is sort of talking about the challenges of the first stage, which St. John of the Cross would call it purgative way. There's the purgative, the illuminative, and the unitive. The illuminative and the unitive follow. Sort of these three stages is the way St. John of the Cross labels them. Just think of them like beginners, proficients, experts. And so understanding how, a lot of us, in fact, most of us are in the purgative stage. And so to understand how the devil tends to attack really helps to sort of combat him in this sort of initial stage. So before we sort of talk about this, let me just talk real quick about like the focus of the purgative way is really virtue and prayer. Okay. So what you're really trying to do is develop the habit of prayer, so that God can bring you to the sort of the higher levels of prayer, which is just union with God. But there's a really big focus on virtue for the simple fact that for grace to be operative, we have to remove all of the obstacles in the way, right? And so the sort of purgative way is exactly that, right? So where we begin to grow in virtue, so that all of the obstacles we put in the way of God's grace are out of the way. All right. So and of course he helps us with actual graces, but that's the work we have to do. All right. Early in the spiritual life, that is the work we have to do. We have to grow in virtue, and only when we have virtue will we be sort of more docile to grace working with us. Okay. And so not surprisingly, then in this letter, those are the two areas that actually that Lewis talks about that the attacks come. All right. Okay, so let's read this little part, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. Provided that any of those neighbors sing out of tune, and so now he's talking about the people in the church with the patient. He says, provided that any of those neighbors sing out of tune, or have boots that squeak, or double chins, or odd clothes, the patient will quite easily believe that their religion must therefore be somehow ridiculous. At his present stage, you see, he has an idea of Christians, quote Christians, in his mind, which he supposes to be spiritual, but which in fact is largely pictorial. His mind is full of togas and sandals and armor and bare legs, and the mere fact that the other people in the church wear modern clothes is a real, though of course an unconscious, difficulty for him. Never let it come to the surface. Never let him ask what he expected them to look like. Keep everything hazy in his mind now, and you will have all eternity wherein to amuse yourself by producing in him the peculiar kind of clarity which hell affords. All right, and so the obvious sort of thing here is one of the ways the devil operates is to try to confuse. But he also understands how the spiritual life works. And so at the beginning of the spiritual life, as a person sort of embarks on sort of makes the commitment to avoid mortal sin in every way that they can, normally what is sort of accompanied by that is this sort of great sensation of sensible fervor. So you have a lot of sort of spiritual feelings, a lot of bodily joy that comes from this sort of newfound piety and prayer. And this, of course, is sort of it's by God's design, right? Where he knows initially that, when someone is a child, they need sweets and candies to keep them acting good, right? And so he knows that. He knows that it's human nature, right? It's not necessarily anything wrong with it. It's just the reality of how we grow, right? And so we will often very early in the spiritual life get a lot of spiritual consolations, a lot of feeling good. Now, the devil is well aware of this, right? And so he knows how to then manipulate that and use it for his own sort of his own designs, right? And so what the first thing he'll do, and this is what he's talking about here, is he will tempt us to sort of use it as a means to pride, right? This sort of self-esteem and self-satisfaction that comes about because it feels like, especially to this guy, right, that his religion is more real, or sort of the real deal, as compared to the other ridiculous ones, right? And he feels sort of more enlightened and more holy. And so ultimately, if the devil can do that, can get him thinking that way, then he sort of has won, right? Because he feels it. He feels like I'm holy, and I'm probably holier than that guy because I look way more joyful than him. And so what this sort of what can happen is what can arise is this sort of spiritual gluttony, where where you just sort of you get almost you get in love with the feelings that sort of happen. Okay, like they begin to really to sort of love the feeling of what they're getting. And so this is one of the things that St. John of the Cross talks about. And so here's what he says. He says, a great deal can be said on spiritual gluttony. There are hardly any persons among these beginners, no matter how excellent their conduct, who do not fall into some of the many imperfections of this vice. The devil, increasing the delights and appetites of these beginners, and thereby stirring up this gluttony in them, all their time is spent looking for satisfaction and spiritual consolation, right? So they go to prayer just for the sake of having spiritual consolation. They can never read enough spiritual books. In 1 minute, they are meditating on one subject and the next on another, always hunting for some gratification in the things of God. God, very rightly and discreetly and lovingly, denies this satisfaction to these beginners. If he did not, they would fall into innumerable evils because of their spiritual gluttony and craving for sweetness. These people incur many other imperfections because of the spiritual gluttony, of which the Lord in time will cure them through temptations, avidities, and other trials, which are all a part of the dark night. All right, and so what St. John of the Cross is talking about here is the way in which God will then remove any consolations he was giving him. Okay, and that's the sort of the second part of what Lewis is talking about in the letter, where the devil recognizes that. He says, work hard then on the disappointment or anticlimax, which is certainly coming to the patient during his first few weeks as a churchman. The enemy allows this disappointment to occur on the threshold of every human endeavor, right? So what is he saying? He's saying that the dryness is coming, right? This is God's MO. This is the way it works, right? And so now the devil has to sort of change tactics, right? He has to change tactics and go for discouragement and disappointment. It occurs when the boy who had been enchanted in the nursery by stories from the Odyssey buckles down to really learning Greek. It occurs when lovers have got married and begin the real task of learning to live together. In every department of life, it marks a transition from dreaming aspiration to laborious doing. All right. And so, so deliberate, sort of what's going on here is that that the devil really sort of hates the person who prays. All right, and so he's going to do everything he can to get them out of prayer. And this is what Saint Teresa of Avila talks a lot about. And these are sort of a couple of quotes I just want to share with you that two of them came from her biography, her autobiography. In truth, the violence was so. She's talking about the violence of when she was sort of setting out on the road, how violent the temptations were to just quit prayer. Um, in truth, the violence was so intolerable that the demon and bad habits did not allow me to dedicate myself to prayer. Such was the sadness this brought about that it would catch me whenever I entered the oratory, so much so that I was forced to plead with all my might. Note what she does though, right? She goes in to pray, and immediately she has this just sadness over it. She's like, oh, this is going to be hard work, all right? And that's sloth. Sloth is sorrow at a spiritual good. So to go to prayer and to be sad about it rather than be joyful. Um, but rather than despairing, what does she do? She cries out to God to help. All right. And how does God respond? Does he respond with all these consolations? No, he responds with the gift of perseverance. All right. The gift of perseverance and courage, the two things she needs. And so we have to understand that the spiritual life is hard work. Right? And the devil is around every corner, every time we go pray, trying to discourage us and trying to get us, it's not just to tempt us by distraction to do something else. It's to give up, to think this is way too hard, right? And when that feeling arises, we have to then turn around and ask God for perseverance and courage, right? Because very often, people come to me and they've been praying every day for 6 months and like I'm not getting any consolation. I'm not getting anything out of this. I must be doing it wrong. When in truth, you're doing it right because God has blessed you with perseverance. Name one thing in this world that you'll do for 6 months that you get no fruit from. There's nothing else. I mean, that's just grace working in us, causing us to persevere, right? So St. Teresa says the deceits and the wiles of the devil are horrible as the devil attempts to prohibit the person from knowing oneself and realize what is going on along this path. Right? This is why we have to study the spiritual life. Right? This is why St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila are such a gift to us to sort of understand, especially St. John of the Cross, who writes very simply. He's very just matter-of-factly. When we understand what's going on within us, it makes it all easier. Like, oh, this is perfectly normal. Like this dryness, this desolation is perfectly normal. This is the normal course of events because, I got to get rid of this vice, this vice, this vice, right? So this idea of self-knowledge, of understanding exactly where we are and being able to assess ourselves well, that's what keeps us going, right? When we know, oh yeah, this is God at work doing this. So she says the more temptations you undergo, the less you should worry about them, since it often regards weakness of the imagination or bad humors. The devil, realizing this, does his part to take advantage of them, right? So if we begin to look at our temptations as weaknesses, and as ultimately as God is using those temptations to form us and to make us stronger, right? So you think of the analogy, which we've used so many times before, of lifting weights, right? Where you push yourself, just a little bit beyond what you're capable of, right? And then the next time you're capable of it. And that's how God uses temptations, right? He uses them as this sort of resistance training. And he only gives us the temptations, right? Because if he just let the devil go, I mean, we'd be totally overwhelmed. But he lets him do just enough that we push just hard enough back that we grow stronger, right? And so that's that part about where Lewis is talking about like how God wants to form sons and daughters, right? Like he wants us to sort of stand on our own 2 feet. Like, that's what he's making us into, and where we can just push back against this creature. The devil is, I mean, there's no comparison, his power compared to ours, his natural power compared to ours, and yet God elevates us to fight back. And so to advance is hard work, right? That's what she's saying. But we have to understand that it's a battle and that we're in it. and that God is sort of permitting it and allowing it. Okay, and so we can't let it discourage us. All right. All right. So that's the end of letter 2. Let's move to letter 3. All right. Letter 3 talks about, I think is a good example of how the devil sort of affects and insinuates himself into relationships. Okay. Um, it's talking mostly about the relationship between the patient and his mother. And I think one of the really important insights here is the idea that demons work together, right? How how they work in tandem often on people, and even just understanding that, I think, goes to a lot, and says a lot. I know, like, certain circumstances where if you've ever had this experience where someone says something, and they say it in such a way um, that it's almost like they knew that it hit you in a place you're really wounded, right? You're like, how in the world did they know that, or did they say that, right? And that's the idea of how the demons tend to work together in order to bring people down. Um, and remember, let's read the section and then we'll just sort of talk about it. When two humans have lived together for many years, it usually happens that each has tones of voice and expressions of face which are almost unendurably irritating to the other. Work on that. Bring fully into the consciousness of your patient that particular lift of his mother's eyebrows, which he learned to dislike in the nursery, and let him think how much he dislikes it. Let him assume that she knows how annoying it is and does it just simply to annoy. If you know your job, uh, you will notice the immense improbability of the assumption. In civilized life, domestic hatred usually expresses itself by saying things which would appear quite harmless on paper. The words themselves are not offensive, but in such a voice or at such a moment that they are not far short of a blow to the face. To keep this game up, you and Glubos must see to it that each of these two fools has sort of a double standard. All right, so the word diabolical, or diabolic, that sort of has a root of diabolos, which means to divide, right? So one of the names of the devil is diabolos, the divider, and so that's one of his main weapons that he uses. Diabolos just simply means to pull apart or to tear asunder, right? And its opposite is symbolos or symbolon, which is where we get the word, which is the Greek word for creed, which is to put everything back together. And so one of the ordinary ways in which the devil tends to act. All right, so last slide. In letter number 3, Lewis talks about how one of the sort of ploys of the devil is to create division, right? So the word diabolical, which is one of the words we sort of use for the devil, comes from diabolos, which means to tear asunder or to divide. So we have to sort of the name, the shoe fits where it, the name sort of fits. So that's one of the sort of ways in which the devil operates. And what Lewis brings out that's really good is he brings out this idea that demons cooperate with each other, and how they sort of pit one against the other. And like, you can think about situations where somebody will say something that really, really hits a nerve, right? It hits you in a place you're really wounded. And they often do it in you're really surprised when someone does that, and very often it's that you can sort of chalk it up to the demons sort of working together. And so that Lewis brings up this sort of tag team, this tandem way in which they work, where they pit each other off of them. And so, like, the example that I've given this example before because it really sort of resonates with me, almost like I'm the guy in the example. But he's like, a guy's driving in the car with his wife, and she's getting really impatient, telling him to pass the car in front of him, and he's getting increasingly annoyed at her. And eventually, he's just like, in his mind, he hears like, "Oh, she always does that." And immediately, like, that's usually the key word when the devil's involved, where you're like, okay, she doesn't always do that, right? Like she doesn't do it everywhere we go all the time, right? So this it usually starts with this accusation that's been absolutized, and that's one of the ways you can sort of tell it's come from the devil. Um, and so immediately when the man latches on to that she always does this, right, and he sort of agrees with it, um, and always sort of indicates that she's got a serious problem. And so with it will then come some sort of accusation, right? Like, oh, she's so controlling. Um, so uh, so the man gets angry at his wife, and then his wife can't really understand why he's angry, and then the devil, her sort of demon is at her going, yeah, he always does that. He always flies off the handle when you're just trying to be helpful, right? He always blows things out of proportion, and that's the idea of them pitting against each other, right? To create this division. Um, and so the antidote to this, the way to stop it is what I would call like compassion in small things, right? Where when a temptation arises to go, she always does that. Like make an excuse for her. Like, oh, you know what? Like she doesn't really always do that, and she's probably just nervous we're going to be late. And so having this little sort of compassion in small things, uh, where and then you go, well, let me reassure her, right? And so then you just reassure her, okay, we're gonna be fine. We got plenty of time. um, and then the other thing that at least I found particularly helpful, of course you can't do this with everybody, but you'll be surprised how often, like in those situations when you're close enough to the person, that you can then sort of talk to them and say, you know what, this is what I'm hearing, and then they counter with, yeah, I was kind of hearing the same thing, right? And so once the devil hates the light, right? I think Saint Ignatius said he's like this sort of, it's like this guy who's trying to seduce a young girl. As soon as you sort of catch them, they run and flee, and that's exactly how the devil operates. uh, so so um, so sort of bringing out into the light, and you can bring it out in the light and just simply say no, like, I know what you're doing, and I'm not going to listen to it. And the devil is a coward, and typically runs once he's sort of been exposed. And so that's sort of the gist of what Lewis is getting at there, the way in which the devil uses division to sort of to as a temptation. And of course there's all the ways in which that ties into insecurities and everything else, and the devil's only too happy to pick on those. All right, so that was the last slide. That was letter 3. Um, what questions are there that we can talk about?
Oh, I just wanted to offer something on that lines. Like, I think asking your guardian angels when you're like having that friction with somebody is helpful too.
Yeah, for sure.
I
The,
think it
the
makes
tag,
sense given what you said. Yeah.
yeah, the tag teaming thing works both. Again, it works both ways, because when you're having difficulty with someone, you can ask their guardian angel to sort of you know help them out a little bit. Like, hey, can you sort of calm them down, or help them reason? Or if I mean, I do this with my kids a lot, where I'll talk to their guardian angels when they're just they're just in a place where I can't really talk to them about something, or they're just being really really sort of ridiculous about something. And more often than not, their guardian angel ends up sort of straightening it out, and then we're able to sort of talk. Yes, Connor.
Um, so I think it's in chapter 3 or letter 3, the number 2 paragraph, and it says, make sure. So I'll read from the start. It is no doubt impossible to prevent his praying for his mother. We have means of rendering the prayers innocuous. Make sure that they are always very spiritual, that he's always concerned with the state of her soul rather than with her rheumatism. So what is he, or what is he trying to say there is in because I guess what I would have thought and what I think would be kind of at least intuitive way for it is like, oh, okay, you're supposed to pray for spiritual things. You're supposed to pray for their spiritual good rather than for their immediate physical good or something like that.
Yeah, I think what he's getting at is the fact that there's already a little bit of conflict. Like, I don't think this is an absolute rule. What I think he's getting at is that there's already this conflict between the mother and her son. And if he can keep focusing on her sin, like, so in other words, like, he's praying for her conversion so that she'll stop being so annoying to him. Whereas if he's actually praying for her rheumatism, he's going to actually start having compassion for her, right? And he's gonna be able to sort of have some empathy and relate to her. So I don't think he's saying something absolute here. I think he's saying that that it would be much better for him to be praying for a problem that he sees versus a problem that he intuits, like that he thinks is actually really there, right? So I think it's more from the sense of, like, when you pray for your enemies, yeah, you should pray for their salvation, but you should pray for their immediate good too, because right now they're your enemies, right? And I think that's what he's getting at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, other questions?
I wanted to understand the relationship between the guardian angel and the demon. I guess the real question. So we discussed how the demon is able to kind of put thoughts into our mind, and then we also discussed the fact that God is the only one who can do that, at least on the good side in this sense. I just wanted to understand why does how is the demon able to do the same thing to us when only God can do it on the light side?
Yeah, so the demon does it a different way, though. So God can
Okay.
put it in there, like, in fullness, right? What the demon is trying to do is get us moving in a direction where he thinks you're going to think something, right? And so that first letter, I think it shows it really good, where he talks about where he has no idea really what God said to him. Hang on a second, let me go. Before I knew the enemy presumably made the counter suggestion. You know how you can never quite overhear what he's saying, that this was more important than lunch. So he's sort of guessing at what the guy is going to be thinking. And so he takes a stab in the dark and tries to move him in a direction. And it just so happened that he was right, and that he was able to sort of control his train of thought. But it's always in it's always in the train of thought, right? And there it's not just a matter of, like, images but they can tell, like, if you're thinking about something that's embarrassing, right? Like, there's bodily changes that happen to you, like maybe your skin flushes a little bit, or and so they study you and they understand you and they understand your reactions to things, so that they can almost literally read your mind, right? Where they can know, okay, I've seen that look before. I know what he's thinking, or wow, the temperature of his forehead just went up a little bit. He's embarrassed. Let me try to make him more embarrassed. And so it's things like that. But everything they're doing is guesswork, whereas with God it wouldn't be.
Got it.
Really, really smart guesswork.
Yeah, but that's also why sometimes you'll get just absolutely ridiculous thoughts. You're like, what the heck? Like, where they'll just, they took a bad, and it's one of those sort of affirmations of, oh yeah, there's more going on here than I thought. When you just get these really stupid temptations, right? Like, oh, I think I'll throw this person off a cliff. Like, it just comes out of nowhere, right? And it's like, oh, you were angry. Oops, I probably pushed too far with that, but it was a shot in the dark. And that's why you'll get really crazy things like that sometimes. But again, like the guardian angel, it's good too, because in the midst of, like, the guardian angel too, when you're really distracted, you can ask him to help sort of block out temptations or help you focus, because he can do all those things. But again, tends to only do so when asked.
I think another thing you had said once was, like, you can also pray that God will, like, confuse the demons or not let them see as much, or not let them see, like, what you're doing. So, because I feel like once you start thinking about this too much, you could easily fall into this thing where you're like, I don't want to talk because then they'll hear me, like kind of deal,
Yeah, they can only see and hear what God allows them to see and hear. Right. So there's always a good reason for it. And a lot of spiritual warfare prayers, do ask God to blind the devil to the stuff that you do. All right. Anything else?
Aaron has a question.
Okay. Wow,
Yeah.
Connor, that was so staged. You
Oh,
gotta
Um,
hate the forced question.
I was just wondering, do we have a guardian angel assigned to us like at some point or at baptism, or I'm not sure when, baptism or birth, but like do we have the same thing with like a demon is assigned to us?
Yeah. So there's a couple of sort of so your guardian angel was assigned to you at your conception, so the moment you were conceived. Although your guardian angel knew of you from the moment of his creation. And most sort of angelologists say that somewhere in the midst of their test was whether they would serve a human being or not. And so there obviously some guardian angel said no and fell, and that could have been your guardian angel, right? And so God assigns another guardian angel to you. But what that means, though, is that there's this demon running around who has literally expert knowledge of you, because that was their mission and they chose not to. So some people just have stronger temptations from the devil simply for that reason, because their tempter knows them way better than than just the sort of average tempter does. That being said, in the sort of grand scheme of the way the devil works, where he always apes God, there is sort of two sort of ideas of whether we have our own personal tempters, or is it just they all sort of work in unison. And I think although we don't know for sure, I think sort of most exorcists would say that we all have sort of our personal tempters too, who get some help from their friends. But the sort of gist of it is that there's a chance that one of the tempters really knows you well because he was assigned to you and chose not to.
One of the coolest things I've heard about guardian angels is that angels aren't distinguishable on like physical characteristics. They're distinguished based on like their mission, because they're just spirit. And so your guardian angel is just like, its literal one and sole mission is to get you to heaven. That's what it was created to do, and that's what makes it different from every other angel. So it's not just like you got a random pick out of the guardian angel army. It's like, yeah, it's cool. I don't know.
Yeah, and just think, and this is really cool. Like, don't skip ahead to the last letter of the book, but it's really cool how there's where the guardian angel is revealed to the patient or whatever. But to think like how much your guardian angel actually loves you, right? Like more than anyone else in your life, right? Like that this is like your best friend, and that's why like a relationship with the guardian angel is so important. Because like he has chosen like to serve you and to get you to heaven, and it's this powerful ally we have who out of love for us, of no other reason, right, like wants to do that, because whether we get there or not, like he still has the vision of God. It's not like, oh, well, you failed, now you're going down to hell. So he does it purely out of love for us, which is pretty awesome.
So, Rob, if your guardian angel was one of the ones that fell, does that mean like, and you said you get like a reassigned one? Do they know you less, or like,
Yeah, I don't know. Some of this, like, a lot of the sort of information we have about like specific things like this comes from exorcists who have sort of gotten the information from demons.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that I've ever read anywhere the answer to that question. I would assume that God would not handicap you,
Mm-hmm.
that he would
So
infuse.
we're confident that there is one reassigned at least?
Yes, yeah, because everyone has a guardian angel. And there's even the idea, and I think most exorcists say this, that we have several, where with different vocations. So like there may be like a guardian angel that's been assigned to a family, and that's been assigned, like, so in other words, like, you know, a priest may get a second guardian angel when he's assigned to the priest, right? I always remember there's a story of this woman who could see people's guardian angels, and she went to World Youth Day, and she saw John Paul II's guardian angels, and she saw these two giant angels standing beside him. And so, you know, if you believe that sort of thing, then there's like, okay, there's these two. He had two guardian angels.